Operation Christmas Child is a project of the Christian international relief organization, Samaritan's Purse, and it's the world's largest Christmas project of its kind. The mission of Operation Christmas Child is to demonstrate God's love in a tangible way to children in need around the world and to share the good news of Jesus Christ. Delivered into the hands of children through local churches, every shoebox gift is an opportunity to share about Jesus Christ and God's love. Since 1993, Operation Christmas Child has collected and delivered more than 188 million gift-filled shoeboxes to children in more than 170 countries and territories. And this year, hopes to collect enough shoeboxes to reach another 10 million children. Will you join Operation Christmas Child this season by packing shoebox gifts or building shoebox gifts online? Anyone can pack a shoebox: individuals, families, churches, students, and even groups. And packing a shoebox is a great way to teach kids about thankfulness and giving back to those in need. During National Collection Week on November 15th through 22nd, shoeboxes will be collected across the country at nearly 5,000 drop-off locations. Visit SamaritansPurse.org/OCC to learn how to pack a shoebox or build one online. The other side of the road is safe, where we sidestep being bothered and avoid getting involved. But rolling up your sleeves and boldly going where few dare to tread, that's walking through Samaria. Each week on our podcast, we introduce you to the special few who walk in the spirit of the Good Samaritan. On behalf of the Giving Company and your hosts, David Hendrickson and Dan Riveros, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. I'm your host, Dan Riveros, with my co-host,
David Hendrickson.
How we doing, man?
Hey, good to see you.
Good to
in
see
person.
You. Yeah, in person.
Right?
Yep.
I mean, that seems to be kind of how we're doing it now.
Yeah, it's rocking and rolling. It's been, it's smooth sailing. No outbreaks. Everything's good.
So we've got a Kentucky connection with today's guest, but I read there's like a new variant that they discovered in Kentucky this morning. I read it on Twitter, so maybe it's not legit. But
if there's one variant I don't want, it's the one that came from Kentucky.
From Kentucky, exactly. From some nursing home in Kentucky. So I don't want to panic all of our listeners. You all will have to validate what I just said. And I do not want to be the source of misinformation, because that's bad. We talked about that with Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan from Georgia last time, Dan.
The Derby variant.
Yeah, that's right.
The Derby variant.
Right. That might be it. Well, to our listeners, I am really excited to introduce today's guest, Josh Deckard. Welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Thank you, guys. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to do this with you.
Are you in Arlington, Virginia today coming at us? All right.
I'm in Arlington, yes.
Well, some of our listeners probably recognize the name, but Josh, if you don't mind, I'm going to read your bio here, and then we are going to dive into some incredible topics that cover politics and adoption and Uganda and all sorts of stuff. So here we go. Josh Deckard is the founder of Hammerstone Capital, an investment company focused on early stage opportunities. Hammerstone has made early investments in Airtable, Ball and Branch, Cubcoats, Sir Kensington's, Techavas, Urban Stems, Mack Weldon, and dozens of other startups. Prior to launching Hammerstone Capital, Mr. Deckard was the assistant press secretary to President George W. Bush. He was the longest-serving member of the press office staff, his tenure spanning from 2002 to 2007. During his time at the White House, Deckard oversaw media operations, including major international summits and addresses to the nation, as well as nationally televised press conferences at the White House, Camp David, and abroad. Having traveled nearly 1 million miles to more than 55 countries with the president, Deckard served as a liaison for the United States government to his counterparts around the globe. Prior to serving as assistant press secretary, he worked in the chief of staff's office at the White House. During the 2000 presidential campaign, he served as a traveling aide to Republican vice presidential nominee Dick Cheney. Mr. Deckard has worked on or advised 3 presidential campaigns. In addition to his leadership at Hammerstone, Deckard is an advisor to several startup companies, including his role as chairman of the advisory board at One Hope Wine, Alton Lane, and Soapbox Soaps. He is a sought-after speaker on U.S. and international communications, business, and political issues. A native of Cincinnati, Ohio, Deckard studied at the University of Kentucky. Mr. Deckard and his wife, Allie, live in Arlington, Virginia, with their 4 children. Josh, it's great to have you on. Thanks so much for joining.
Welcome, Josh.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. I chuckled when you said some of your listeners may recognize the name. I think 2 will, and that's my mom and my oldest son, who I know will listen to this podcast. I'm not sure anyone else.
So that's two. That's two. Yeah. Well, Josh, let's start at the beginning. And, you know, one of the themes that runs through the Walking Through Samaria podcast is common ground. And we think that's actually inherent in the parable from Luke chapter 10. We have some common ground, sort of. You went to the University of Kentucky. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, although you're from Cincinnati, which is a little bit of a rival town across the Ohio River. Tell us a little bit about growing up in Cincinnati and how in the world did you sort of wander into the political realm?
Yes, I grew up in Cincinnati. At the time when I was a kid, I believe it was rated the best city in America to raise a family. Certainly a wonderful place to grow up. And I have just really, really fond memories of my family and my friends back there.
Like Skyline Chili and...
You know, I'm one of those weirdos. I'm super... all my kids are less picky than I am. I am obsessed with Cincinnati food. I have never eaten Skyline Chili in my life.
Oh, no.
Shockingly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but La Rosa's Pizza, Grater's Ice Cream, Montgomery and Ribs. I go down Penn
There you
Station.
go.
Go down the list.
Is that where the Mall of America is?
No, it's Minneapolis.
That's Minnesota.
Why do I always get those confused?
Yeah.
It's, it's all middle America. It's kind of the same. But yeah, so I grew up there and went to the University of Kentucky for a year. Was a horrible student growing up. Kind of shocked I got into college. Did not do well at school. Was really excited to, just kind of get past college and jump into business or whatever I ended up doing. But had this amazing opportunity in 2000 to work on President Bush's presidential campaign. And so I went down to Austin for a very short time. And then after Vice President Cheney was chosen as the VP nominee, I spent the rest of the campaign traveling with him. I went back to school for one semester after that, and then had an opportunity to intern at the White House starting in 2001.
Wow.
And yeah, it was amazing. I mean, a couple months into my time at the White House, I just remember saying to my boss, I've learned more in any given week during my time here than I did in the past 13 plus years at school.
Yeah, for sure.
I'd love to stay. I'll work for free. And so let me think about it. Came back a couple weeks later and said, okay, we'll let you stay for up to a year, but then you got to go back to school. I said, all right. At the time, I thought I was giving my word, or I was giving my word. That ended up changing, but I ended up sticking around and getting hired in another office and stayed about 6.5 years there.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the Kentucky Wildcats are coming to Athens, Georgia on October 16th, Josh, and I've got a slew of friends from Louisville coming in their blue and white to cheer on the Wildcats. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I have not followed Kentucky football for a while, but I did.
It's probably not a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, a friend of mine told me the other day, he said they might lose 2 games all year. One of them will probably be Georgia.
Well, they're a very good team. They're a very good team. I think, in all seriousness, I think that'll be a very good game.
That's sweet. That's awesome.
Yeah.
My mom went to Georgia, by the way.
Oh, outstanding.
Okay.
Well, there we go. There we go.
Dogs on top, David. Dogs on top.
Dogs on top. That's right.
I saw you had Ben Watson on your podcast, right?
We did.
Right?
We did. In fact, yeah. He's a part of season 3. He was great.
Love him. Huge fan. He's been just absolutely instrumental in helping me think through really complex issues in my life and in the lives of some of my family members. And,
that's great.
Just really have a deep respect and admiration for him.
Very wise, great ambassador for the university. It was funny on the podcast. We asked him kind of, where does your loyalty lie? Because he played for a number of pro sports teams, and he said, "Hey, I worked for the Patriots. I root for the Georgia Bulldogs."
That's awesome.
So he made it very clear where his loyalties lie, which was fun.
It was fun. That's awesome.
So, here's a question: why do press secretaries never seem to last that long?
Yeah, you were an assistant press secretary, Josh, and you lasted longer than anybody. They rotate all the time.
Yeah, well, I wasn't very important. I was very low on the totem pole, so that helped. But the average person works at the White House throughout administrations. I would say on average about 18 months. So it's not really just press secretaries. It's
gotcha.
They just happen to be the face of the White House. We were fortunate. I was thinking the other day, about a recent administration that'll go unnamed, but we had as many press secretaries, I believe, in 8 years as they had in 4. So we only had 4 press secretaries in the course of 8 years. So that was actually really long.
That's pretty good. Yeah.
By White House standards. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a hard job, though. I mean, you've got multiple bosses, right? You've got the president, you've got the American people, you've got the press corps. You're dealing with a lot of people and a lot of folks who, on the surface appear maybe opposed to one another, even though I don't really think they are. So it's a challenging job. It's a thankless job.
Yeah. Well, I love what you just said, because Dan and I actually emphasized this with the Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, Jeff Duncan, because he wrote in his book that just got released in early September. He wrote about his constituents being his bosses, right? He said, I've got to go meet with one of my bosses, and it was a constituent in his district. Awesome. And it's just refreshing to hear people in government referring to the citizens as the bosses, because that's sort of how it's supposed to work.
It is,
and I think in some cases we've kind of lost our way about who's in charge in government and in politics.
Yeah, I was super fortunate to work for people who drove that point home day in and day out. And President Andy Card, who is our chief of staff, just made it very clear that we were there to serve something greater than ourselves, to serve the people.
Yeah.
And it certainly kept arrogance and pride and all kinds of selfish characteristics that can arise when you're in a place like the White House from popping up.
That's good. Well, we've worked very hard, Josh, to not strike a political tone, on this podcast. We're very interested in policy, and we've asked Asia Brown to be on. She's the mayor, or was the mayor of Compton, California. We've asked Van Jones to be on. Obviously, Jeff Duncan has been on the show, and now you're on the show. Because part of our Dan and I's message, Dan and I would probably in the media and probably in society, Dan, people would think you and I are different, right? Mm-hmm. You're a younger Latino American. I'm an older, Caucasian dude, and we've had different paths, and yet we're having a blast co-hosting this podcast about common ground and about loving your neighbor with no descriptors on your neighbor. And so it's always very interesting when we see in the political realm just really good examples of people playing out the Good Samaritan. We just celebrated, I guess you don't celebrate, recognized the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. And it did seem, Josh, that people, the American citizens, the electorate, if you will, tried on 9/11 to just strike a more unified tone, whether that was in the media or on social media or in whatever kind of interaction. And again, to our listeners, apologies if this seems partisan. It's not the intention. But it sure seems like President George W. Bush gave a heck of a speech on 9/11. And obviously he was in office during, the actual 9/11. President Clinton even, retweeted it and made some comments on his speech. I found you on Twitter. We're going to talk about that in a second. But one of the things that I noticed in your Twitter feed, Josh, was you did take an interest in President Bush's speech, and it seemed to impact you as well. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I'm biased. I have a deep love and respect and admiration for President Bush. Aside from my family, I don't think there's anybody on earth that's had a greater impact on my life and my family and the way I want to live my life. I think his 9/11 speech was like so many of his speeches. I think when people actually sit down and listen and don't watch the 2-minute clip that made the nightly news, which was one of humility, gratitude, bringing people together. I think one of the things we saw after 9/11 and 2001 was how much he brought our country together. People who, I think people forget we came out of a very contentious election. Things were not peaceful between the parties in heading into 2001. And after 9/11, the president really unified the country in a way that certainly in my lifetime I've never seen. I remember that night before going to bed and throughout the week, I remember watching members of Congress from different political parties who really did not like each other standing together on the Capitol steps singing. I remember people who did not vote for the president that I knew reaching out, talking about how grateful they were for the way in which he was bringing the country together. I saw a unified front, even in Washington, D.C., which is such a divisive city, people coming together and seeking to serve one another, encourage one another. And it really, politics were completely set aside. And unfortunately, I think we've lost that so much. I had lunch with a friend yesterday who also worked at the White House, and we were just talking about how different it is that, during a pandemic, another major issue around the country and around the world, and just how different things are right now than they were in 2001.
Yeah.
And let me just say, too, I obviously I worked for a Republican president, and I'm right-leaning, but some of my best friends worked for President Clinton. Certainly some of them worked for President Obama. I have friends that work for President Biden. So, I'm not one of these guys. When I came to D.C., I didn't know that was even possible, but I've really benefited tremendously from people who think differently than me and who see the world differently than me. And it's important to me that those types of folks are in my life and in the lives of my children as well.
Love hearing that. That's
great.
Cool.
Yeah. That's part of it. And at the risk of being uber repetitive to our listeners, we tend to highlight this from the parable in Luke chapter 10, which is the hero of the story is a Samaritan. The victim, if you will, is a Jewish man. And at the time, Jews and Samaritans were culturally, politically, socially, religiously, ethnically at odds with one another. There was no more opposing factions in humanity than Jews and Samaritans, and yet we have this parable in Luke chapter 10, which reflects, I think, what you just said very eloquently. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I love that parable. My kids' school spent the entire school year last year going through that particular passage, and it's something we talk about frequently as a family. So I love that you have a whole podcast based around it.
That's it. Well, tell us how you transitioned out of politics to venture capital and board work and startups and those kinds of things that you're doing at Hammerstone.
Yeah, so honestly, nothing I've ever set out to do in my life has happened, and everything good that's happened to me has been providential from the Lord and not something I've planned on. I alluded to this earlier, but I never finished school, so I completed about a semester or a year and a half at the University of Kentucky. Never went back and finished, and so when I left the White House, I knew I wanted to start a family. And there were some other things I wanted to do before I really got back to work. And I was fortunate enough to have a little bit of time off, which was great. But during that time, I was totally freaking out because I had no clue what I was going to do or how I was going to do it. Most of the people I worked with, at least the younger guys and gals that I worked with, were leaving to go to Harvard Business School or Stanford Business School or some top-notch private equity firm or Goldman Sachs. And none of those things were an option for me. I couldn't have done the job, and two, nobody in their right mind would have hired me. So I was at one point looking at taking a job at Starbucks just so I could get insurance so we could start a family. But fortunately, some people I had worked with started reaching out to do some consulting things and some speaking things. And so I went to Australia and was giving speeches. And then I had some folks from the Spanish embassy that I had worked with over the years reached out asking if I could help advise a company that wanted to come to the United States from Spain. And so I was doing these random different things that would pay the bills. And one of those companies I got involved in ended up becoming a partner in. And through that, learned about startups and investing and raising capital and all these different things. And I started making small little investments in the companies, and some of them worked. And a couple years into doing that, I realized I was spending pretty much all my time looking at startups. I was probably get, 3 or so pitch decks sent a day.
Okay.
And probably around 2012, I started doing it full time. So yeah, it's really something I stumbled into. I love it. Every day I get to learn about new companies, new sectors, new technologies. I'm never the brightest guy in the room, so it's really fun for me to be able to surround myself with super smart people that are the best in the in the world at what they do and learn from them. It's really, really fun.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Very cool. Very cool. So, okay, let's talk about your family today. Give us some insight.
Got an amazing wife, Allie. We've been married a little over 16 years and 4 beautiful children. So my boys are Whit, Hudson, and Chase. Chase goes by the nickname Fire. We can get into that if you want. Whit is 11, Hudson's 9, and Chase is 8. And then my daughter, Sydney, is 6, almost 6.5.
Wow, that is awesome.
It's a full house, man.
It is a full house. They're amazing. It hit me the other day. We had at one point 3 boys that were 3 and under, and 2 of them couldn't walk. It was just like the whole early years were a total blur, but we're in a really wonderful, sweet spot right now with their ages. And honestly, I don't think I've ever had a job that I love. I don't think I'll ever have a job I love as much as being a father. It's the best thing. It's 100% what I believe God's called me to do in this world. So I'm really, really thankful for it.
That's great. That's great. Well, you're going to have to tell us the Chase, AKA Fire story. Is Chase your only adopted child?
He is.
Okay.
Yep, he is.
So tell us how that came about.
So when my wife and I got married, we like a lot of people, talked about what we wanted our family to look like, Lord willing. And, at the time we just thought, we'll be married this year, this many years, and we'll, try to have kids and so on and so forth. And found out it doesn't really work that way. But plan A was actually always to adopt. And so, I'm sure you've talked to other adoptive families, but oftentimes you'll have one spouse who wants to adopt and one doesn't, or one wants to adopt a boy and one wants to adopt a girl, or one spouse wants to do domestic and the other international. It was really amazing because Allie and I both felt like the Lord was calling us to adopt a young boy from Africa. Those 3 things were very clear to us.
Okay.
And we didn't feel like it was going to be our first child. And so after we came along and Allie had given birth to him, we started looking into adopting from Zambia. And what we found was there's about 1 million orphans a year, or there's about 1 million orphans in Zambia, but only about 10 a year are adopted in the United States. And Allie and I, right after I left the White House, one of the reasons we want to leave is we went on a short-term mission trip to Zambia and we fell in love with it. And I had been all around Africa, but that's the only time she had been there. And so we really tried for years. And I went back to Zambia with President Bush in 2012 after he left office. And I remember talking to a guy there and, expressing my interest in adopting. And he basically told me, look, this isn't going to happen.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you should look elsewhere. Yeah, it was super deflating and sad because we really felt like we had clarity from the Lord. And so we came back and talked about it and prayed about it. And the Lord led us to an agency out of Florida that focused at the time on Uganda. And it became very clear that was actually where our son was. And we just needed to go through the process to adopt in Uganda. And so, we went over there in 2013. We weren't sure how long we'd be there. Some people said 4 weeks. Some people said a year or longer. We took our other 2 boys at the time with us, and we ended up being there about 5 weeks. And to this date, they're the hardest and best 5 weeks of my life. They're absolutely amazing. But every day there was a different challenge or opposition that made it look like we weren't going to be able to adopt him, or at one point it looked like we were going to have to move there for a couple of years to be able to finalize the adoption. But the Lord really provided in ways that we've never experienced before or after. So it was a really precious time for our family.
Wow. So hard, meaning under the conditions you guys were in over there, or just difficult in the process of adopting?
Yeah, it was hard because we didn't know how long we'd be gone. We were away from our friends and family. Chase was pretty sick at the time. He was getting better, but he was pretty sick. So he was up for hours every single night, really the first year he was in our family. And so, we started getting sick because we weren't sleeping. And at one point someone tried extorting us, which we did not give into. And thankfully, we saw God provide a miracle. Really, somebody who told us that if we didn't pay this bribe, we were going to lie about our situation so the judge wouldn't give us a favorable ruling. And we just said we're not going to do that. And we went and met with it. We traveled about 6 or 7 hours to meet with this woman. And by the end of it, I was praying with her, and it was just my wife and I were praying with her. And it was just a really sweet time of seeing things that on the surface appeared really sad and difficult and hard. And at one point, the judge actually ruled that the way the ruling was written, we weren't able to get the documentation to get a visa to come bring him back to the States. And as you can imagine, judges don't really change their ruling. But our lawyer just said, hey, I would encourage you to pray about this, and we'll keep pursuing it. And within a week or so, she actually changed her ruling, so we were able to get the proper documentation to get the visa to come back. So there was this thing like that time after time and after time. One of my kids, my son Hudson, at one point was sitting on my lap and went pale white and was the hottest I've ever felt a human being. He was totally limp. I thought he was dying, honestly, in my lap out of nowhere. And I just prayed, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. I was terrified. And I was like, Lord, you can do this, heal him. And like in front of my very eyes, he snapped back and was fine. I mean, there was just time and time again where there was just challenging, difficult things that were terrifying, but we saw God work in ways that really built our faith. And it was really fun to see how he used that to build other people's faith while we were over there communicating with friends back home as well.
That's good. How, Dan and I try to be really careful in terms of how we position things to our listeners, because we never want to seem condescending or shaming or anything like that. But how would you encourage believers, in light of the parable in Luke 10, to view adoption?
Yeah, so Scripture interprets Scripture, which means that through that parable, we have to look at other passages and see what the apostles and what Jesus tell us.
Yeah.
And he tells us that we are to care for the orphan and the widow. And so does that mean every Christian or every person needs to adopt? No. Does that mean that every Christian needs to care for orphans in some capacity? Yes. And I would say that for many people, that means adoption. This wonderful woman who started following me on social media, I don't know how old she is, I want to say in her 70s or 80s, sends me these really encouraging messages from time to time. And right before Chase's recent gotcha day, she sent me a note saying, my husband and I, her husband just passed, she said, my husband and I always wanted to adopt, but we didn't have the finances. And it just broke my heart because I remember reading Adopted for Life by Russell Moore and him just encouraging people, never let that be the reason. God will provide. And one of the things we did when we went through the adoption process was we decided, a lot of people asked, how can we help? How can we support? And so we decided we were in a position where we could afford. Adoption's expensive, but we could afford it. But we decided, why don't we raise the money and then match it for other people's adoptions? And so we were able to do that, which was really cool. And honestly, we hit our goal right when we got to Uganda. We'd been trying for close to a year, many months. We hit our goal right when we landed in Uganda. So it was amazing. But seeing a lot of other people who aren't in a position to adopt for one reason or another would have been overly challenging for them. They were able to participate. And to this day, Chase and Allie and I and our whole family are still able to thank them. And I feel like they were able to play a role in that. But not just through adoption. Orphans and adoption aren't synonymous. And so, whether it's fostering or supporting orphanages or babies' homes or single moms, whatever it is, I think that there's a lot of ways that Christians can go about this.
That's great.
Very cool.
That's great. Well, to our listeners, I want to tell a good Twitter story. Very often when we talk about Twitter, we talk about trolling and divisiveness and people saying all sorts of things on social media, very often anonymously, because their addresses, their Twitter handles, if you will, are not their names. And it's just this vicious environment of combativeness and all sorts of things. And I'm probably most disappointed at how believers, behave on Twitter. But this is a good Twitter story, Dan. So I'm not quite sure, Josh, where our connection is on Twitter, but I did see somebody, obviously, that I'm following retweet Chase's video. And I think it was in celebration of his 8th either birthday or 8th anniversary of his adoption, or those may be close to one another anyway. But I was really moved by his, I think it was a minute and 27 seconds or so video on Twitter. Can you and that's ultimately literally how we got connected and how you are on our podcast today. Tell our listeners about your son's campaign.
Yes, my guess is it was Ben Watson who retweeted it. He was
well, there you go. There you go. Yeah. That's probably right.
He's been amazing in Chase's life and was really helpful during that time. So as Chase's 8th gotcha day, we called it gotcha day, it's the anniversary when he was adopted, as that was approaching. First of all, I'm a horrible dad because I think the first time I tweeted, I said his 7th gotcha day, and then I realized, oh gosh,
yeah.
it's his 8th. So his original goal was to raise
way to go, Dad. Yeah.
$7. Yeah. And I was like, actually, we got to up this. But we talked, what do you want to do? And what are things how you want to celebrate? And, one of the things I asked him, is there anything you want to do, for folks back in Uganda? And so we came up with this idea to help. We're pretty involved in a school there in Western Uganda, and our kind of point of contact there has been telling us that there were a lot of families in the school and in the surrounding area that have been starving because of COVID. Pre-COVID, they were eating about one meal a day on a good day.
Oh, gosh.
And COVID's just made it really, really challenging. And so Chase's goal, a dollar goes a long way in Uganda. Chase's goal was to feed 400 families for, let's say a week or 10 days, something like that. And so we did this video. My friend Mark Campbell put it together. He's incredibly gifted and talented. Everyone's like, oh, Chase did an amazing job. And Chase did do an amazing job, but Mark's editing is also amazing. But we put this out, and the goal was to then raise $8,888. We thought that would cover the 400 families and maybe provide some buffer to do some other stuff over there. And Chase ended up raising over $31,000 from about 200 people. Yeah, it was incredible. Just people, some people we know really well, and some people we've never met in our lives. And even after his gotcha day, we kind of were closing out. I got a text message from someone saying, "Hey, I missed the deadline. I'd love to contribute," and send another $500. So the money was still coming in, and it's really amazing. So I'm working with the guy, my buddy Andrew in Uganda, to try to figure out the bet. We want to obviously be respectful of other people's hard-earned money that they've contributed, and so we've already been able to feed 360 families. We're going to feed significantly more. We're going to take the rest of the capital and hopefully be able to start some sustainable food servicing. So, piggery, maybe some stuff with goats and some other things. So build some dorms on the school and some other stuff. So those dollars we're hoping to stretch as long as possible.
That is awesome.
Very cool.
As parents, I find sometimes it's difficult to sort of step back from your personal connection, because obviously you're Chase's dad, and look at things, sort of from an objective, passive kind of above the trees scenario. So if you don't mind, try to step back, Josh, and obviously it's your son in the video. It's incredible how articulate he is and how personal the story is. But why do you think, stepping back, there has been this, almost 4x response to the call for $8,888?
I think a couple things. I think one, we live in a time where you talked about things are very divided, and you go on Twitter, you go on social media, it's very negative. And all of a sudden you have this beautiful, handsome young man with joy talking about wanting to do something good and to help people.
Yeah.
And I think people gravitate towards that. So there's that. Chase has an incredible and magnetic personality, and he's touched a lot of people. I have a friend who every time I see him, he tells me, "Chase is the best kid I've ever met in my life." And, I think that the same is true of all 4 of my kids. But Chase he just has he has a servant's heart. He loves other people. He cares deeply about them. He feels and thinks very deeply. And he has the best smile and personality of anyone other than my other 3 kids. I have to keep saying that because I know they're going to listen and hates me. No, it's true that they're all amazing. But he just draws people in. And so I think people see that.
Yeah.
And so many of those people, like I said, some were strangers, but so many of those people have already been personally touched by Chase and had their lives affected by him, even though he's 8 years old. And I think that this was just a way to give back. And I think for other people, it's like what we talked about earlier. They want to be able to help orphans or widows or other people who are poor and struggling, and they don't know how. And this just provided an opportunity to do something that the Lord has already placed on their hearts.
That's great. That's really awesome. Well, you touched on this for a second. If you don't mind, I'd like for you to give it a little more color. Giving Company has a few friends that have been involved in Uganda, Amazima Ministries, Katie Davis Majors, and I rode on the plane with the executive director one time, actually going to D.C. Liz Bohannon, that we've talked about a few times, Dan, on this podcast, also does work in Uganda. Can you tell us, just give us a little bit of a picture of Uganda, Josh? You know, how tough is it there before and during and after COVID? And, you know, why do you, obviously your son is from there, but what is it that would cause us or prompt us to kind of get focused on Uganda and help Uganda?
Yeah, Uganda is a beautiful country. I would say Western Uganda, where Chase is from. I've been to over 60 countries, and I don't think I've been to any city, state, country that remotely compares to the beauty of Western Uganda. So it's just a gorgeous, special place. But even more than that, the people, there's such a joy and a delight. And we're talking about kids who don't have shoes and people who are struggling to eat a meal a day, with an incredible joy, hope, and optimism. So it's hard to be in a place like that and not gravitate towards it. And so I had been there twice before. I think both times were in 2003, and then we went back in 2013. But it's poor. It's incredibly poor. They were completely, AIDS just ripped through that country, caused a lot of brokenness in homes and in families in multiple generations. It's really hard to get the actual stats on orphans in Uganda, but it's in the millions. Some people would classify an orphan as a child with only one parent. Maybe that parent is or is not in the picture. But even if you look at children without either parent, it's well over 1 million in that country. And so there's a lot of need there. There's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of need, but there's a lot of beauty happening there as well.
Gotcha.
And
yeah.
Not only from, I want to be careful because it's not like just Americans in the Western world are moving in and saving it. I mean, even in Uganda, my buddy Andrew, this is a guy who does not have very much. And yet day in and day out, and I talked to him, he has malaria or he was separated from his family for 6 months during the lockdown. They're going through hard things, and yet day in and day out, he is sacrificing time, energy, and money to serve others, the school, the community, bring clean water. So I just love the spirit in Uganda. It's very much a place where people want to love their neighbor well. That's
great. That's great.
Very cool. So how can people follow you and learn more about your work over there?
Yeah, so the stuff we were doing before Chase's Gotcha Day was really just stuff we were doing together as a family, and a couple other people had reached out and just said, hey, we want to sponsor kids or whatever, which was really cool. So we've partnered with a organization called Educate Me here in DC that focuses on educating kids in Uganda. But I think one of the things that came out of this time with Chase's Gotcha Day celebration and having 200 people support it is that I think there is a desire to want to do more. And so working on plans now on how we can have long-term sustainable partners to help us sponsor kids and build out some of the stuff we want to do in the school and the surrounding neighborhood. So right now I'm on JS Deckard, or for Twitter at JS Deckard. And that's probably the best way, but you can add to my 12 or 15 followers, whatever I have on there.
You and I both, Josh. You and I both.
So just for context, do you have an idea of how much it costs yearly to sponsor a kid over there?
Yeah, we're working through getting those numbers. Educate Me, they're educating kids mainly around Kampala, where we're doing it in Western Uganda. Pricing is a little different. But right now, it's really not much more than $1 a day, no matter which school we end up going with. But the one that we kind of oversee in Western Uganda, we think that'll stretch even further. But right now, it's about $42 a month, and that's providing education and food and all kinds of other stuff.
Wow. That's awesome.
Yep.
Well, Josh, as we wind down, I'm going to ask you a tough kind of closing question. But for our listeners, I just think, Josh Deckard was in politics. Like believers can be in politics. Believers can be balanced and humanitarian and philanthropists, even coming from the political realm and the investment realm. So this has been a really refreshing discussion about kind of your life and following the Lord's calling and the way you're approaching being a dad and all those things. So I just appreciate the lesson that we're all getting, Josh, in this conversation. As we do wind down, I do want to ask you to give some good Samaritan advice to our audience. And we're going to do this a little bit differently than we've done in previous podcasts, Dan. So I'm going to kind of almost put you on the hot seat, Josh, like the old ESPN show. And I'm going to rattle off some terms, and I'm going to ask you in sort of your most poignant, kind of concise but sharp way, give our audience a sense as to how we can impact the kingdom like good Samaritans in some tough areas. So here we go. You ready? You ready for this, Josh?
I'm ready.
All right. Social media.
Can I answer a question you didn't ask first?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just as you were talking about politics. So
I'll give you some time to think of the answer.
Yeah, I wish my brain could do two things at once. But Michael Ware is a guy I've gotten to know a little bit over social media, and we did an interview together at one point. But he worked for President Obama, and he often talks about his belief that politics is a forum for loving our neighbor.
That's good. That's good.
And so often, Christians want to retreat from it because it's hard, and people think of it as messy, but it's actually one of the places we should be moving towards. But I would just say, on social media, one of the things I drive home with my kids as often as possible, we try to talk about this daily, is we can use our words for one of two ways. We can build people up or we tear them down. It's never neutral. And I think the same, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Out of the overflow of the heart, the keys type, or the fingers type. And so I think every single time we tweet, and I'm guilty of this, I want to put snarky things, or people put something on there about somebody I love, and I want to get defensive. But I'm going to stand before God and give an account of my life, which includes every word I ever speak and every word I ever type. Now, thankfully, I have Christ who covers all of those mistakes I've made and will make, but it does not excuse my behavior. And so I want to use Twitter as a place to point people to Christ and to build them up. And I fail to do that, but I believe, especially as Christians, that's what we are called to do.
Awesome. Next one, politics. You talked about this a little bit, but politics.
Yeah, so I shouldn't have jumped ahead.
No, you're good. You're good.
Politics is a wonderful opportunity to be able to serve others. Very few people go into politics because they want to make a lot of money, so that's usually not the reason. But it is. Tim Keller often talks about money, sex, and power are really the three things that drive us. And so there is this deep desire. I think when you're in politics, you have an incredible opportunity to have a lot of power. At a very young age. I was 20 years old. I was flying on Air Force One before I could drink a beer. You have this incredible opportunity to be able to influence a lot of things at a very young age. And unfortunately for me, I started out in that world not as a Christian, and it was all about me and what I could get out of it, how I could benefit. Thankfully, the Lord saved me in 2003 during my time there.
Wow.
But it shifted, and it started being, okay, now I'm here not for myself, but I'm here to serve others. Again, I didn't and don't do that perfectly, but I think politics, like anything else, we can flip burgers to the glory of God. We could work at the White House to the glory of God. And so wherever we are, I think we want to live everyday life with gospel intentionality.
Love it. Two more. The marginalized.
Yeah. Can you tease that question out a little bit? Yeah, tease that out a little bit more for me.
So, maybe with a focus on Uganda, right? So let's talk about widows and orphans. Let's talk about the poor.
Yeah. I think we are one to pray for them, to serve them. And for many of us, that means driving down the street and helping locally. For some of us, that means overseas. Some of us, that means with our time. Some that means with our money. For some of us, it means both. I think really we just need to do something. I think there are no shortage of opportunities to serve the poor, to serve the orphan, to serve the widow. And, Jesus clearly had a deep and profound heart for the poor. And one of the things that I pray for is that the Lord will increase that, because that's not my natural bent. Honestly, I don't wake up in the morning thinking I want to serve and love the poor. I need to pray for that, and I need the Lord to constantly conform my mind and my heart towards them. But the more I look to Christ and watch how he lived his life, the easier that becomes.
It's good. I want to put a pin on that for a second. Dan, we've had a number of people on this podcast talk about just do something, right? Like Josh just said, like just do something. I think Danielle Strickland said that. I think Batia said that. The Abenity guy.
That's what I'm
said
thinking
that.
of.
What I mean? He kept McDonald's gift cards in his.
Yeah.
He and his wife kept McDonald's gift cards in their glove compartment in their car, so that they would inevitably encounter a homeless person on the corner. They would hand out gift cards with scripture. And so for all of our listeners, I go back to Luke chapter 10, like the just do something was the Samaritan who just walked across the road, just walked to the other side of the road where other people had walked on by, like a Dionne Warwick song, and served the Jewish person, frankly, overserved him, right? So checked him into the inn, paid the innkeeper, came back to check on him, made sure he was kept and fed and healed. And I just think sometimes we can get lost in the magnitude of the problem at hand, the poor, AIDS, COVID, homelessness, foster kids. The numbers are just huge. But if we all did something, I think we would make a huge impact. Last one, Josh. This is go ahead, please.
I hate to do this. I think this is an important point. I think for Christians that are listening, when we think, oh, I got to do this and I got to do that and I got to do this, we're misinterpreting the gospel. I think what we get to do is we get to say, I was broken. I was dead in my sin. And Christ in his mercy initiated and came towards me. And because he took the initiation and rescued and ransomed me, now I get to take the initiation and move towards others. And we are going to be debilitated if we're trying to earn our way to the Lord or to seek to please him by doing good. It can only be in response to what he has already done for us. And when we do that, there's actually joy in it. And we realize that Jesus actually was right. It is better to give than to serve. And so, my encouragement to the listeners is if this is a struggle for you, rather than looking at all the things you need to do, look at your Savior and see what he's done for you. And out of the overflow of that, I think your heart will be transformed.
Yeah, it's so well said, Josh, and I appreciate you giving color. And I think we talked about that a lot, Dan, as we talked about issues of race, early on, because we've recorded this podcast during the George Floyd incident, the Ahmaud Arbery incident, which was exclusive to Georgia, and a whole host of other ones. And Lee Jenkins, Nate Butler, Benjamin Watson, they've all have said, apart from the gospel, this isn't going to go well. And
that's right.
And I appreciate you pausing us there and giving it that color, because I think that's appropriate. Here's the last one, Josh. This is probably unfair, but you know what? You've been an assistant press secretary. You've run presidential campaigns. You're in private equity. You've adopted a child from Uganda and raising lots of money for Uganda. So you're going to be somebody that I think we can turn to on this one. But man, how do we do better being good Samaritans in COVID time?
Yeah, great question. First of all, you should be a press secretary because you just beefed up my resume way better. How do we do? This is hard because I'll be honest. COVID has made more clear to me how selfish I am. I've wanted to retreat. I've wanted to spend more time with my family or a close group of friends. I don't think those things are bad. I think they're actually inherently good. But what it stopped me from wanting to do those hard things and reach out to people who are different than me or might take more work and more effort. So I'm not going to answer this as someone who's mastered it. I'm going to answer this as someone who day in and day out is struggling to figure it out. But I think it's what we just talked about a little bit ago. It's what can I do today to be faithful to what the Lord's asked me to do? Who's in front of me today? You talked about those gift cards. My kids have made these little homeless kits, they call them. They get these bags and they put toothpaste and deodorant and some other stuff in there. And we're at a red light and someone's asking for money, maybe it's contributing to somebody's fundraiser. Maybe it's just sitting down and spending time with people. I think honestly, one of the greatest needs right now, obviously people have to be careful of vaccination, all that stuff, but is physical presence and time with people. I was reading recently stats about the importance of human touch. And so I started really thinking about so many single people who've spent the last year and a half alone without a hug or affection from others, and just having one person like that in your home. And I was listening to a Matt Chandler sermon the other day. He talked about hospitality not being, something where we add a dinner. It's just pulling up a chair to our dinner table.
That's good.
And so I think, I think we're looking for these all over the place. I will say, speaking of Chandler, one of the things he said in that sermon that's really stood out to me is every day he looks for surface level conversations that lead to serious conversations that lead to spiritual conversations. And I thought that was so well articulated. It's how I want to live my life, but articulate to those three things. What are some surface level conversations we can have with people that lead to serious conversations about what's going on in their life that can lead to spiritual conversations to point them to the one who gives us hope?
Wow. Well, how about that, Dan? I feel like that's how we should wrap it up with that right there. Shallow to serious to spiritual. I think that's awesome. Josh, I can't thank you enough. Dan and I can't thank you enough for spending time with us today. Just an inspirational story, your personal history, your family, and the work that you all are doing in Uganda. This has just been a treat. So on behalf of our listeners, I really want to thank you for joining the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Thank you, guys. This was super fun, and I hope to meet you in person soon.
Yeah, let's do it.
Tell our listeners one more time where they can follow you at.
Oh, yeah. At JS. If anyone's still listening, it's at JS Deckard, Deckard, on Twitter.
Awesome.
All right, man. Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
guys.
All right. Well, that is it for today, everyone. This is David Henriksen with my co-host,
Dan Riveros,
with very special guest, Josh Deckard. Thank you so much for tuning in on the Walking Through Samaria podcast. We'll talk to you next time.
See ya. For more content like this, visit us at givingcompany.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Walking Through Samaria.